Hey guys, it's Filter SC here, and I'm back for episode number 3 of my Heart of the Swarm Bronze to Master series. We're going to continue taking a look at the absolute basics here, and for this particular video we're going to talk about choosing a race. Now, a lot of you have probably already picked a race, you've already played a few games. I'm sure a lot of the people that follow my videos are Terran fans because Terran's my main race. It's the race I enjoy playing the most, but I'm going to take a look at all the different races and try to help you macro up in all the different races throughout our Bronze to Master series and our journey here. For me personally, I'm definitely looking forward to learning more and more about the different races as I go through the series. So, without further ado, let's jump right into this one. Alright, so the first major point I want to make at the start of this is, when you do choose your race, you might not necessarily like it. You might be playing a race right now that you're not necessarily a big fan of and you're looking at changing. Starcraft is about having fun, so the most important thing is you pick a race that suits you, you enjoy, and you have fun with, and if you stop having fun, don't be afraid to change. That being said, what you don't want to do is change races every time something seems overpowered or too strong or whatever, because that's all going to get fixed and changed in various patches. Sometimes it takes an entire expansion to fix problems, but hey, whatever. We're here, and so far Heart of the Swarm seems to be working really well, creating some really dynamic, exciting games for all three races this time around. Okay, before we jump into our first race, let's talk a little bit about playstyles. I want to make this very clear. Every single race has their choice of economic cheese, every single race has their choice of cheeses, and every single race has their choice of standard play. Don't pick a race based on having the best cheese, don't pick a race based on having the best standard play, because they're all about equal. Right now, you're starting to see certain races on the ladder haven't quite figured things out, so they're cheesing a little bit more often than other races that maybe have things figured out a little bit better. Don't worry about it at all. All the races are capable of all three different play styles. That being said, each race has its own strengths and weaknesses, so let's dive right in. Alright, so the first race we want to take a look at is Terran. Now, the overall style of Terran is there's lots of planning in advance, and build orders tend to be very smooth if they're executed properly. The reason Terran needs a huge plan going in is because you can't really do any tech switches or too much advanced stuff down the line. So with Terran, you want to be very smooth with your opening build order. You want to practice it lots offline, so that when you get into a real game, you can kind of execute your plan all the way through. And there's few situations where you have to change your composition a little bit, like getting Ghosts or Vikings against Protoss, depending on what they're doing. Sometimes you need both. But for the most part, Terran is pretty much mapped out all the way through the entire game from the moment you load into the game. So if you're somebody who really enjoys kind of planning and having a grand strategy as soon as you enter a game, Terran might be the race for you. Now let's take a look at the pros of Terran in general. The biggest strength of Terran probably is the fact that they're just simply immune to build order losses. There are very few builds that will just kill a Terran off without the Terran player making mistakes. What that means is, as a Terran player, typically you don't get cheesed all that often because it's difficult to have a timing or something that they can hit that will kill you off if you don't make mistakes. So that's things like, adding extra bunkers if you spot the Bailey bus coming. But by and large, you're just not going to lose because your build order that you chose in advance of the game cost you the game. The next thing is there's a huge amount of build varieties from Terran. Pretty much any unit that you can think of that Terran can make is viable as an opener in one respect or another. That gives Terran a huge advantage because your opponent really doesn't have any idea what you're going to make until he starts seeing units come out, regardless of what his scouting looks like. So the fact that you can produce pretty much anything is a huge strength. The other big strength of Terran is there's a ton of micro opportunities. This is one of the biggest reasons why you see a huge amount of Korean dominance, because typically their micro is very strong and their build orders are planned out all the way down to the T. So when you see a really strong Korean Terran player, typically he's taking full advantage of all those micro opportunities. With Terran you can drop in 3 or 4 places at once, while microing at the front. Almost all the units that Terran has are capable of being better with good micro. Not every other race can say that. In fact, a lot of the other races' units just simply don't present that opportunity. But with Terran, pretty much everything you make is better if you control it properly. And the last strength of Terran is the fact that there's two very unique compositional styles that you can run. You can run the mech style, which is just, a big death ball, and you're slow pushing your opponent, you're slowly choking him out. Your opponent can't attack into you really with a big mech ball. And it's if you're a grand strategist, that style of play tends to be quite popular. The other style is obviously Bile, which is much more aggressive, and you're dropping all over the place. You're trying to do damage. You can't really win a straight up fight with your opponent typically, but at the same time, super fun to play. And both styles are very viable, and both styles are completely unique in terms of the way Terran can play. That being said, there are some downsides to Terran, so let's take a look at the cons. The most obvious one is that Terran is prone to opponent tech switches. What that means is if you get caught with your pants down, and your opponent starts making Colossus after you open with Templar, you're probably just going to die. You have to kind of scout that in advance and be preparing and make Vikings. Same thing with Zerg if they switch from Broodlord to Ultralisk. That really late game tech switch can just cripple a Terran if you're not prepared for it. So you really have to be ready for that stuff and scouting and trying to figure out what he's trying to do. And there are some cases where that tech switch is just going to catch you off guard and there's nothing you can do because you don't have the resources to kind of switch up like the other races are able to do. Now, another con would be the good micro that is required off a Terran player. And when you play Terran, you have to have pretty good multitasking and pretty good control if you want to get far with the race. You don't need superstar micro or anything to be a decent Terran player, but the better your micro is, the more it's going to help you out. So you definitely do need to have some good micro, otherwise the race is really going to feel quite weak and not very strong to you. The other weakness is just low map control before 10 minutes. If you do any kind of expand with Terran, because your production takes so long to build and get up, and you need so much of it, you're just not going to have very much before 10 minutes. And moving out on the map is very dangerous, even if you're just trying to clear off a watchtower. If you move out onto the map with a small force and you have no real way to retreat it, Bio is actually quite slow pre-stim, and getting stim before 10 minutes, sometimes you can get it around 9, but it's quite difficult to do. And even then, if you get caught off guard with a big push that your opponent just happens to catch you as you go to clean out the watchtower and get that map vision, it's quite difficult. Typically you'll die. So the big thing with Terran is you don't have much map control before 10 minutes. It's very difficult to get it. After 10 minutes, you have some of the best map control though, because your army is capable of running away from pretty much anything. You can take a lot of fights. You have drops going all over the place. Lots of cool stuff you can do. The next weakness is just Terran has by far the worst ability to produce units. Because Terran units are tied to not only a structure but also an add-on, it's very difficult to produce a whole bunch of units really quickly. Protoss has warp in, Zerg just has the larva mechanic. So if you're caught in a situation where both of you have big banks, both you and your opponent, and you trade armies completely, typically you're just going to lose that game because you can't reproduce your units very quickly. And the last weakness of Terran is because outside of the really heavy mech composition, typically Terran is quite fragile and they don't have a good production capability. What that means is if you make one mistake and get your army killed off in a situation where you just had it on move command or something happens, you run into burrow banelings, whatever it is, you can just instantly lose the game off that singular mistake. The reverse is not really true for the other races, although a major mistake can obviously cost them the game. Not responding to a drop properly, that kind of stuff. But Terran probably has it the worst in terms of a single mistake being able to kill them off. Okay, so the next race we're going to look at is Zerg. Now, the overall style of Zerg is this very organic gameplay. Ladder practice with Zerg is great, but they are mechanically demanding. So, what do I mean when I say ladder practice is great and they kind of have organic gameplay? With Zerg, their build orders are typically not tied down to anything too specific. It's very easy for them to change completely what they're planning on doing based on what their opponent does. Zerg, by and large, just has all sorts of options available to them, and that's kind of how their overall style works. So if you like just going on ladder and playing like 20 games and learning how to deal with certain stuff, because the first time you see a heavy Terran bio push come with 2-2 at like 11 minutes, it's probably going to kill you. Maybe the second time you hold it off with just small adjustments to kind of your overall playstyle. If you like playing a lot of games, Zerg is probably the race for you. Now, the pros for Zerg are pretty straightforward. Zerg is excellent at tech switches. If Zerg needs to switch from, Roach to Hydra, boom, done. You throw down your Hydra Den, you're done with the tech switch. It's super simple, straightforward. You can start mass producing Hydras. If you want to go from Broodlord to Ultralisk, they basically share the same upgrades, because Broodlings use the melee upgrades. So again, really easy tech switch for Zerg to do. No other race can really compete because Zerg can their composition can look totally different in two different armies that get killed off at different times throughout the game. Really good at tech switches. Then the other strength is you rarely don't have the tech you need as Zerg. Because so many units kind of fit together and you need to get all your different tech structures up, typically with Zerg you're going to have the ability to make whatever you need when you need it. It's important that you kind of make the right units and you don't make the wrong ones, because then you get yourself killed off. But at the same time, you rarely don't have the tech that you need. The other great strength of Zerg is their units work really well together. What I mean by that is things like Zerglings and Banelings are both really good against the opposite style of units. So Zerglings are really good against kind of armored units that are easy to surround, like siege tanks and marauders. Banelings are really good against things like Hellions and Marines. Right? So it's just kind of a, you need both types of units, but they work extremely well together. The other big strength with Zerg is if you're mechanically, you have very, very good players, so like you never miss an inject, you're going to find yourself in Masters just based off your injects. Zerg and their overall mechanic control and how well they reward it is unmatched, pretty much. Terran is mechanically demanding and extremely so, but Terran is kind of pre-planned mechanics. Zerg is in-game mechanics, meaning as long as you're not making mistakes in the game in terms of your overall mechanical play, you're going to be in really good shape. The other thing about Zerg is really, really good map control. What do I mean by that? Well, Zerg, combined with their overlords and Zergling speed and things like Metalisks, you should have full map vision almost at all times. Things like creep spread help that out. So it's a huge advantage for Zerg because they can pretty much see their opponent coming from any angle, and that helps with things like drop defense, that helps stop pushes, that helps make sure that you have the right units when you need them, that kind of stuff. No other race is even close to Zerg in terms of overall map control ability. And this goes from basically minute 1 into the game. Zerg's map control is the best. The final thing about Zerg is kind of just a footnote, but they have the best static defense. Bunkers are fantastic, so are missile turrets, but at the same time they don't compare to spine crawlers and spore crawlers. Spine crawlers and spore crawlers don't take supply. You have anti-air and anti-ground, and typically with Zerg you have excess minerals, so dumping them into static defense is never a bad thing. Makes it really easy to protect expansions from things like drops until it gets to the really late game when the Terran units are 3-3 and that kind of stuff. But overall, best static defense definitely goes to Zerg. Now let's talk about the cons for Zerg. Zerg really they don't have a whole lot of cons, because when you play Zerg it comes down to your mechanics more than anything, but the one thing that the Zerg is really prone to is early game cheese. If as a Zerg player you make a couple of mistakes in your map control and you don't, you produce a big long run of drones, then all of a sudden you see your Terran opponent or Protoss opponent moving out with a really early attack, you're probably going to die. Things like proxies are devastating to Zerg. Things like 4 gates and 6 gate with +1. There's lots of cheeses that can just kill off a Zerg if you're not properly prepared for it. And with Zerg, there's kind of anti-timings where you can just kind of screw yourself over by making a big round of drones. Makes you very prone to cheese, where you just lose, and it's not even necessarily your fault. You just lost to the cheese. The next thing is tech resets are absolutely crippling. If you run into a situation where your opponent drops your main and he kills off your infestation pit and your hive, your tech is back basically down to Zergling, and you're crippled and you're almost out of the game. So you really have to protect your tech buildings, because any kind of tech reset is absolutely crippling. If you've ever lost your Greater Spire just before it finishes, you know how long it takes to get a new one. So just, even stuff like losing your spawning pool where you can't make Zerglings for a long period of time, that opens you up to a huge timing window where your opponent can kill you off, and usually your opponent will know that when he does that kind of damage. The last con for Zerg is really very limited unit compositions. What I mean by that is typically Zerg units, because their strength is they work really well together, you can't just kind of mix and match. Like, you're not going to go Ling Hydra, because those units don't work together. You need to go like Ling Bang Muta, or you need to go like Roach Hydra, or you need to go like Roach into something, you can go Roach Ling. But the way Zerg works overall is just, your compositions are very limited in terms of overall what you can use. Yeah, throughout the game you might use all the different units, but you have to use them kind of correctly together to get the most success out of it. Okay, so let's talk about Protoss. Now, the big thing with Protoss is they have very powerful death balls. and typically a Protoss player will end the game on a single push. It's very rare for a Protoss game to get into a situation where the Protoss army gets killed off and he trades it off and the game's prolonged. Even if the push takes 5 or 6 minutes and it's a very slow push, Protoss typically just wins with their initial push whenever that comes, whether that's later in the game or kind of mid-gamey type push. So if you like getting kind of a big ball of units and then going and killing your opponent, Protoss might be the race for you. Now the big pros with Protoss are very easy to change unit mixture when you talk about gateway units. If you need more sentries, if you need more zealots, if you need more stalkers, archons, whatever it is, you can kind of just warp into either what your minerals and gas dictate you have and what you should make, or what units make the most sense in that situation if you have kind of a bank built up. It's very easy to change and have your unit mixture just right with Protoss because you have so much variety in terms of what you can warp in off a gateway. Terran doesn't have that option, and with Zerg they're not able to reinforce quite as quickly, although they do have basically the same option with the larva mechanic. Now the other thing about Protoss is as it gets to late game and you start to get Archons up, you have Colossus up, maybe you have Skytoss up as well. For Protoss it's really easy to tech switch into what they need at the time, and that's in terms of late game. So if you want to go from Colossus to Templar, it's really easy to make that switch. It's not a big deal with Protoss. Pretty straightforward. The other thing about Protoss is they have very strong early game harass and very strong late game harass. Their mid game harass is actually quite weak, but their early harass with things like the Oracle, things like quick DTs, things like just zealots marching into an expansion on a Zerg are actually quite hard to deal with for the other races. And then as you start to look to the late game, things like a mass zealot warp into dump minerals, or if there's extra gas around, just warping in a bunch of Dark Templar. Dark Templar late game are super hard to deal with and super annoying. If the game's at 20-25 minutes and you just warp in 2 or 3 Dark Templar and send them off to your Terran opponent, you're going to stress them out a lot more than you're stressing yourself out. So the early and the late game harass from Protoss is excellent. Their mid game harass, not so much. The reason their mid game harass isn't very good is because if you warp in like 8 zealots and they're not in your main army, you might just end up losing the game if your opponent's able to hold off those zealots, because they probably need to be with your main army, because the Protoss units all work very, very good together. Now, the other thing about Protoss is early game micro, so when you only have like 2, 3, 4 units, being able to micro those all so your Stalker goes back and recharges his shields, that kind of stuff is really, really important in the early game. And the last thing is Protoss has excellent drop defense. With the warp in mechanic, if a Terran player is coming in to drop, you just warp in like 6 or 7 zealots and you're going to stop a medevac drop. Cold in its tracks, no problem, especially if they're charged lots. Yes, the medevac can pick up and leave, but at the same time, as long as you keep some supply and you're ready to go with the warp in, you're going to be good to go. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make, though, is they warp in Stalkers to try to stop a drop. The Stalker won't warp in until the drop lands. The Stalkers are going to lose to the Bio Ball, and that drop is going to be a major issue. So unless you have your Blink Stalkers in position to pick off the medevac before it lands or before it drops any units off, you want to use Zealots in your drop defense. Zealots in a drop defense mean the Terran player either has to micro against the Zealots or just lose this drop or pick it up. Just based on a basic bio drop, it is not going to kill off your 6 or 7 Zealots on its own. So make sure you're warping in Zealots if you don't catch the drop and it's already landing. If you're going to be able to catch the drop, then it's okay to use Stalkers. But please stop making that mistake. I see people do it all the time and then complain that Terran drops are OP. No, they're not. You're just using the wrong units. Very simple change that'll help your game a lot in terms of drop defense as a Protoss player. Now, when we start talking about cons, the biggest con Protoss has is they're very susceptible to what's called build order loss. If as a Protoss player you decide to go for some really quick oracles and you don't get a Robobay, and the Terran player goes for Widow Mines, you don't have any defense in your mineral line, guess what? You lose the game because you don't have detection. If you're playing a PvP and your opponent goes for some sort of Dark Templar play and you don't have a Robobay, you lose the game because you don't have detection, because you're not going to get it up in time. So there's a lot of situations where Protoss can just lose the game based on their build order. And that kind of limits what you can play, but at the same time, sometimes you just have to take a chance because that's kind of the way the current metagame is going. So, unfortunately, a lot of build order losses are going to happen to Protoss. The other thing about them in terms of negative is their early and mid-game build orders are very, very strict. if you start trying to kind of free flow it and build what you want, you're going to find you're going to die a lot in the early and mid game with ProTOS because you're simply just not building the right units at the right time. What happens is if you're not prepared for a Terran push at like 6 or 7 minutes or 8 minutes, because your build order is just loose and it's not very good early on, you're just going to lose those games. So it's really important that your build order is tight and it's very strict in the early and mid game. The other thing about ProTOS is they just have terrible map control. As a ProTOS player, you really only have observers that are going to give you that map control. You can take some of it early with stalkers, but once kind of Zergling speed comes out on the field, once Stim comes out on the field, your army really needs to be in one clump together. So your overall map control is just awful. You can only have so many observers on the field, and if you have a couple watching for drops and one watching his army, maybe he snipes it off. Your map control is really bad as a ProTOS player, and you have to keep that in mind when you're playing. The next thing kind of ties into that, and that is you have to take the right battles as a ProTOS player. If all your zealots are dead, and then you charge into a bio with just Colossus and Stalkers, that bio army with a couple Vikings is going to win pretty much every time. So you have to make sure you're taking the right fights because you're not running away. More importantly, your expensive units like your Sentries and your Colossus, that kind of stuff isn't running away. Colossus are not running away from Vikings if you make a mistake. Sentries are not running away from Zerglings or Roaches if you make a mistake. So it's really important that you take the right battles. And that ties in again to the next point. ProTOS has a lot of very expensive units that are absolutely crippling if you lose them. If you push out with 6 or 7 Sentries to try to knock Zerg off a watchtower and somehow he gets us around and kills them all off, you just lost the game. Because your Sentries are essentially just junk on their own without force field, but you need them in your main army to kind of hold things off. If you push out and you realize the Terran player is going to beat you, and he snipes off like 5 or 6 Colossus with his big Viking ball as you retreat, you're going to lose the game because you just lost all your expensive units, and it is absolutely crippling if you lose them at the wrong time as a ProTOS player. Something you really have to keep in mind. And the last thing, this is a huge con for ProTOS. ProTOS is very metagame dependent, even now. So whatever the popular strategies are, you better know them as a ProTOS player, you better be able to do them as a ProTOS player, otherwise you're just not going to have much success. ProTOS has probably done a million different builds as they try to continuously push through the metagame, and each time a build gets figured out, it becomes unviable. Something like the 4-gate is a really good example. At this point, it's probably anti-meta, and you could probably win a bunch of games because people just aren't prepared for it. But once people started to figure out how to stop the 4-gate, players that were 4-gating would find themselves dropping from Diamond to Platinum, or just losing their leagues because they weren't keeping up with the meta. So as a ProTOS player, remember, you have to keep up with the meta, or you're just going to lose the game. Alright guys, that wraps up this particular episode. It went on a little bit longer than I wanted it to, but hey, that's not a big deal. And the next episode is all about how the mind learns Starcraft. That is going to be the single most important episode you take from my basic Bronze to Master series. As always, you can find me over on Twitter, @FilterStarcraft. I'm pretty good about responding to stuff. You can find me over on Team Liquid. My name is Filter on Team Liquid. Feel free to send me a private message. Do usually respond to those ones. And if you're interested, you can check out my stream. It's twitch.tv/FilterSC. Hopefully you guys have some good games, and I'll see you guys next time.